The dust on Kesavar Station's execution platform hadn't settled in 300 years, and it wasn't going to start today. Callum Reyes stood at the back of the crowd, hands jammed in the pockets of a flight jacket that had seen better decades, and told himself for the fourth time that he wasn't going to watch this. He was going to buy his coolant filters, load his cargo, and get his ship, the Marigold, off this rust bucket of a moon before the docking fees ate what was left of his savings. That had been the plan an hour ago. Now he was standing in a crowd of maybe 200 frontier settlers, off-world traders, and Kesavar militia, all of them facing a raised platform where a woman knelt in chains. She didn't look like the propaganda holos made Vulpines look. Those always showed snarling beast things, feral and huge, fit only for cages. This woman was slight, sharp-boned, with russet-red fur along her forearms fading to cream at the wrists, and two long fox-like ears that lay flat and trembling against her skull. Her tail, what was left of it, matted with dried blood, was bound tight against her leg. Someone had beaten her recently. Recently enough that one eye had swollen half shut, but the other, gold and furious, was open, and it was fixed on the crowd like she was daring every single one of them to look away first. Nobody did. Callum didn't either, though he wanted to. Vashti Thorncall, the magistrate was saying, reading off a data slate in a bored monotone, like he'd done this 100 times, which, Callum realized with a sick lurch, he probably had. Captured smuggling Vulpine refugees through the Kesavar corridor in violation of the Ashgrave Compact. Sentence: public execution, at dawn, as example to any who would harbor the Queen's rebels. A ripple went through the crowd. Someone near the front spat. Callum had seen a lot of ugly things in 11 years of running cargo on the frontier. He'd seen slavers' auction blocks disguised as labor contracts. He'd seen corporate governors starve out mining towns that missed a quota. He told himself he'd learned, a long time ago, that you couldn't save everybody, and that a man who tried usually ended up dead, or worse, in debt to somebody who'd make him wish he was dead. He believed that. He'd built his whole miserable, scraping by life around believing that. And then the woman in chains lifted her chin, looked dead at the magistrate, and said, in a voice that didn't shake at all, "My people will remember every name in this square." The crowd laughed. Some of them, anyway. The ugly kind of laugh. Something in Callum's chest went hot and reckless, the way it used to when he was young and stupid and still believed a person could matter. He didn't decide to move. His feet just went. Wait! He shoved through the crowd before his brain caught up with his mouth. Wait! I invoke the Ashgrave marriage accord. The magistrate blinked at him like he'd started speaking in tongues. Half the crowd turned to stare. Callum kept walking, right up to the edge of the platform, heart slamming so hard he thought it might crack a rib. "The what?" the magistrate said. "Article 9 of the Ashgrave Compact." Callum's voice cracked on the words, but he pushed through it. He'd read the compact once, years ago, bored out of his mind on a 2-week supply run, mostly because there was nothing else to read. He'd never imagined he'd need it. Marriage between a recognized citizen of a treaty species and a captured combatant grants immediate diplomatic asylum, pending review by a treaty tribunal. It's still on the books. It's never been repealed. That law's for nobility. Someone in the crowd shouted. Some old loophole for royal marriages, not for. It says citizen, Callum said, louder now, and pointed at himself. Human citizen of the Ashgrave Compact territories. That's me. I'm a licensed independent hauler, registered out of New Providence. That makes me a citizen in good standing. He didn't know if that last part was strictly true anymore. His registration was 2 years lapsed, but he was betting the magistrate didn't know that either. The woman on the platform was staring at him now with her one good eye, and it wasn't gratitude in her expression. It was something closer to disgust, laced with disbelief, like he was a new and more baffling species of vermin. You're joking, she said. I'm really not, Callum said. The magistrate looked between them, sweating despite the cold morning air, clearly working out whether enforcing an obscure treaty clause was worth the paperwork versus whether ignoring it was worth the diplomatic incident. Kesavar was a backwater, but even backwaters answered to somebody, and the Ashgrave Compact was old, and old laws had teeth even when everyone forgot they had a mouth. "This is completely irregular," the magistrate finally said. "So's executing a treaty citizen without tribunal review," Callum said. He had no idea if that was true either. He was making roughly 60% of this up as he went. "You want to explain to a compact auditor why you skipped the marriage asylum clause because it was inconvenient?" Silence. The crowd had gone very quiet, the ugly energy curdling into something uncertain. The magistrate looked at the woman. "Do you consent?" Vashti Thorncall looked at Callum like she was deciding whether death might actually be the better option. "Do it," she said finally, flat and furious. "I am not dying in this dust hole for a human's audience." It took 11 minutes. 11 minutes, a very confused station notary dragged out of a supply closet, a data pad thumbprint, and a recitation of vows so bureaucratic they barely qualified as vows at all. "I bind myself as protector under compact law, I accept the obligations and privileges thereof," and then Callum Reyes was, on paper, a married man. The chains came off her wrists. Nobody dared argue further. The magistrate looked deeply relieved to have an excuse to pass the whole mess up the chain to someone else's jurisdiction. Vashti didn't thank him. She stood, rubbing raw wrists, tail dragging in the dust behind her, and said, "This changes nothing between us. You understand that?" "Sure," Callum said, still a little breathless with the scale of what he'd just done. "Wasn't expecting a honeymoon." "I mean it," she said, gold eyes hard. "I know what humans think a marriage grants them. I have killed men for less than what you are thinking right now. I'm thinking," Callum said, "that we have maybe 20 minutes before that magistrate's superiors call back and unconfuse him, and then a lot of people are going to want to shoot both of us. So unless you'd like to keep arguing about my intentions on the platform where they just tried to kill you, I'd suggest we move." Something flickered behind her eyes, not gratitude still, but a grudging recalculation. "Fine," she said. "Where?" "I've got a ship," Callum said, and started walking fast toward the docks, not looking back to see if she'd follow. "She's ugly and she's loud and half her systems only work if you hit them, but she's fast enough, and she's mind-free and clear, which is more than I can say for most things in my life." Vashti followed. Of course she followed. She didn't have anywhere else to go. The Marigold was a Corvette-class light freighter, 31 years old, with a cargo hold that smelled permanently of engine grease and dried protein rations, and a cockpit held together by Callum's own stubbornness, and roughly 400 hours of unlicensed repair work. She wasn't much. But she was fast in a straight line, she had a hyperdrive that Callum had personally rebuilt twice, and most importantly, right now, she had her engines warm and ready. Vashti stopped at the base of the boarding ramp and looked up at the hull like it had personally offended her. "This is your ship," she said. "This is my ship. It looks like it's held together with hope. Hope and about 6,000 credits of scavenged parts," Callum said, jogging up the ramp. "You coming, or you want to explain to Kesavar security why the executed prisoner is loitering at the docks?" She came. She moved with a controlled, careful limp that told him her injuries were worse than she was letting on, and she said nothing as the ramp sealed behind them, and she said nothing as Callum threw himself into the pilot's seat and started running pre-flight in a sequence so fast it was more muscle memory than procedure. Klaxons were already sounding across the docking ring by the time the Marigold cleared her berth. Callum didn't wait for traffic control clearance. He hauled the freighter into a hard bank that sent loose tools sliding across the cockpit floor, and Vashti grabbed the co-pilot chair's frame with both clawed hands, ears flat, and said something in a language Callum didn't recognize that he was fairly sure was a curse. "Seatbelt," he said. "If you can find it under the there." Behind them, 2 Kesavar patrol cutters were peeling off from the ring, running lights flashing red. "They're going to fire," Vashti said. They're going to try, Callum said, and pushed the marigold into the thin upper atmosphere, riding the thermals like a man who'd spent a decade learning exactly how much abuse this particular hull could take. A shot went wide off the port side, close enough that the shields flared visible for a half second. Punch the auxiliary power, the panel on your left, the red switch, not that one, She got it on the second try. The marigold surged forward, and Kesavar's brown horizon fell away into the black, and Callum threw them into the jump calculation he'd already half planned in the back of his head since the moment he'd opened his mouth back in that square, because some part of him had known, even then, that this wasn't going to end with a handshake and a polite goodbye. The stars smeared into lines. The jump klaxon chimed. And then they were in transit, and the cockpit went quiet except for the low hum of the drive and the ragged sound of two people breathing hard. Vashti Thorncall sat very straight in the co-pilot's chair, hands folded in her lap, blood drying dark on her temple, and said, "You are either the bravest man I have ever met, or the stupidest. Odds are decent on both," Callum admitted. "Why did you do it?" He didn't have a good answer. He turned it over for a second, this stranger's fierce, exhausted, furious face, and settled on the truth, since he figured a woman who'd just watched him lie fluently to a magistrate deserved at least one honest thing. "I don't know," he said. "I just couldn't watch it happen. That's all. Wasn't some grand plan." She studied him for a long moment, gold eyes unreadable, and then looked away, out the viewport at the star-streaked dark. "Well," she said, "it was a foolish reason. But I suppose it will have to do." She wouldn't tell him her real name for the first 3 days. Oh, she was Vashti Thorncall. On the marriage certificate the notary had printed, Callum had watched her write it herself, in sharp, slanting Vulpine script, the translator implant in his jaw rendered into standard a half-second late. But every time he used it, something flickered behind her eyes that told him it wasn't quite right. Not a lie exactly. More like a name she wore the way he wore his jacket, functional, protective, not quite the truth of what was underneath. He didn't push. He had his own reasons not to like being pushed on. Instead they settled into an uneasy rhythm aboard the marigold, ping-ponging between the small crew cabin she'd claimed without asking and the cockpit where he mostly lived, because the ship only had the one cabin with a proper bed and he wasn't about to make an injured woman sleep in a cargo hammock, whatever she thought of him. "You could simply drop me at the nearest neutral port," she said on day 2, while he was resplicing a coolant line that had started weeping under the floor plating. "I have coin. Not much, but some. I do not require your continued charity. It's not charity if I'm the reason you're a target," Callum said, not looking up from the wiring. "Every bounty hunter between here and the Ash Grave Rim is going to hear about the human who married an escaped Vulpine noble to dodge an execution. That's a story. Stories travel. You step off this ship alone, you've got a target on your back and no protection, because guess what? That marriage clause doesn't mean squat if we're not actually together when the tribunal review comes up. I am not helpless. Didn't say you were." He glanced up. She was standing in the cockpit doorway, arms crossed, ears pinned, every line of her radiating the specific fury of someone who hated needing anything from anyone, let alone from him. "I said you're a target. Different thing." She didn't have a counter for that. She left instead, tail lashing, and he heard the cabin door hiss shut hard enough to trip the pressure sensor. He didn't take it personally. Or he tried not to. It was hard, some nights, lying in the pilot's chair with a blanket over his legs because he'd given up the bed on day 1 without being asked, and somehow that hadn't earned him a single ounce of goodwill, to not feel a little stung by how thoroughly she despised the idea of him. But then he'd think about her face on that platform, the one good eye, defiant even in chains, and he'd think, fair enough. I'd hate every human in the galaxy too, if they'd done to me what they did to her. He didn't know, yet, what they'd done to her. He would learn. It would take weeks, and a great many quiet moments either of them meant to have, before she trusted him enough to say it out loud. On day 4, She came into the cockpit at 0300 ship time, when she thought he was asleep, and stood at the viewport a long while, looking at the stars. Callum wasn't asleep. He rarely slept well, hadn't in years, not since the debts started piling up and every creditor's message made his stomach drop. He watched her from under half-closed eyes, the ragged silhouette of her against the star field, tail curled tight around her own legs, ears drooping in a way he was starting to understand meant something like grief, in Vulpine body language, rather than simple tiredness. "You should be resting," he said quietly, so as not to startle her. She didn't jump. Vulpine hearing, he was starting to realize, was sharper than his by a significant margin. She'd probably known he was awake the whole time. "I cannot," she said. "Every time I close my eyes I see the square. The magistrate's face. My cousin's." She stopped herself. "Your cousin?" A long silence. Then, quiet, almost too quiet for him to catch. "Ren. He was captured with me. They killed him first. Made me watch before they." She stopped again, jaw tight. Callum sat up slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves, the way he might around a spooked animal, except he was smart enough by now to know she'd bite his head off, figuratively or otherwise, if he ever let that comparison show on his face. "I'm sorry," he said. And meant it, more than he expected to. Sorry does not raise the dead. But there was less venom in it than usual. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't. Doesn't cost me anything either, though, so I figure it's worth saying regardless." She turned then, gold eyes catching the dim cockpit lighting, and studied him with an expression he couldn't quite parse, something between suspicion and the first thin edge of curiosity. "You are a strange human," she said. "You're not the first person to tell me that." "I imagine not." She looked back out at the stars. "My people call your kind the grasping ones. Because you take land, resources, dignity. You take and you call it commerce, or law, or manifest destiny, and you never once ask what it costs the ones you take from." Callum thought about the debts eating his ship out from under him, the corporate lanes that squeezed independent haulers like him dry, the way frontier governors treated men like Callum as disposable labor with a ship attached. "For what it's worth," he said, "some of us get taken from too. Doesn't make it the same as what your people have been through. Just doesn't make me one of the ones doing the taking neither. Or trying not to be, anyway." She was quiet a long moment. "Perhaps," she said finally, "you are simply a different flavor of grasping. Time will tell." But she didn't leave the cockpit after that. She sat, instead, in the co-pilot's chair, tail curled around her feet, and watched the stars with him in a silence that wasn't quite as cold as it had been 3 days before. The first hunter found them on day 9, at a fuel depot orbiting a gas giant on the edge of Ashgrave space, a nowhere waypoint called Devlin's Rest that existed for exactly one reason: cheap deuterium and no questions asked. Callum should have known better than to relax there. He didn't, not fully. Old habits from years of dodging creditors kept one hand near the Marigold's weapons console at all times. But he let his guard down enough to walk the fuel dock himself instead of sending a drone, because the drone's sensor array was glitching and he needed eyes on the actual coupling. The man who approached him wore a bounty hunter's rig, all matte armor plating and a holstered pulse rifle, and he had the specific, unhurried gait of someone who already knew he'd won. "Reyes," the man said. "Callum Reyes. Independent hauler, out of New Providence, married, and isn't that a story? 9 days ago to one Vashti Thorncall, fugitive of the Ashgrave Compact." He smiled, showing too many teeth. "Word travels fast when there's a bounty attached. 20,000 for the girl. Alive, preferably, though the client didn't specify a condition, if you take my meaning." Callum's blood went cold. "She's a treaty citizen. Marriage asylum, pending tribunal review. You touch her, you're violating compact law." "Compact law's real cute out here in the rim," the hunter said. "Nobody's tribunal review's gonna reach Devlin's Rest, buddy. You know that. I know that. Let's not pretend. Callum's hand drifted toward the sidearm he wasn't wearing, because he'd been stupid enough to leave it aboard the Marigold, and the hunter's smile widened like he'd clocked exactly that mistake. Then something moved behind the hunter, fast and low, and the man went down hard, choking. Vashti's forearm locked across his throat from behind, having apparently decided that watching from the ship's cargo ramp wasn't nearly close enough for her tastes. You should learn, she said into the hunter's ear, voice like ice, that Vulpines do not need rescuing quite so often as your kind assumes. She released him, letting him crumple, gasping, to the deck plating, and looked at Callum with an expression that was half fury, half something almost like amusement. Also, you left your weapon on the ship. Again. This is becoming a pattern. In my defense, Callum said, heart still hammering, I did not expect a bounty hunter to walk up to me at a fuel dock in broad orbital daylight. You should expect it from now on, she said. There will be more. She was right. There were more, 3 more before the month was out, each one a little better armed, a little more determined, drawn by a bounty that kept climbing as word spread across the rim that the runaway bride and her human husband were still, and probably, at large. Each time, Callum and Vashti found their rhythm a little less like two strangers forced together by a legal technicality, and a little more like a crew. Him flying, her fighting, the two of them arguing constantly about tactics, and neither of them, somehow, ever quite losing. It was on the third encounter, a shootout in a scrapyard station above a dead mining world, 3 hired guns and a corrupt local sheriff all after the same bounty, that Callum took a plasma graze across the ribs, shoving Vashti out of a crossfire she hadn't seen coming, and she hauled him back to the Marigold, half carrying him, snarling threats at anyone who came near, and sat up with him the whole night, while the ship's ancient medical kit did what it could. You are an idiot, she told him, somewhere around 0400, pressing a fresh dressing to his side with hands that were, he noticed, not quite steady. You could have died. You'd have been fine, he said, wincing. You're the one who actually knows how to fight. That is not the point. Her ears were flat, her voice tight. The point is you chose to take a wound meant for me. Again. Why do you keep doing that? Callum thought about it, through the haze of pain and the medical kit's admittedly questionable painkillers. Guess I'm just used to it, he said finally. Taking hits for things I care about. Ship mostly before this. Now it's... He stopped himself before he said something he wasn't ready to say, wasn't sure he'd even earned the right to feel yet. Now it's more complicated, I guess. Vashti didn't say anything. But she didn't leave his side that night either, and in the morning, Callum woke to find she draped her own jacket, worn, patched, smelling faintly of gun oil and something warmer underneath, over him at some point in the small hours, and never once mentioned it again. It was Vashti's idea, 3 weeks in, to divert to Corvain Deep. There is a relay point there, she said, spreading a battered paper star chart across the cockpit console. She didn't trust digital NAV data for this, she'd explained, not for something like this. Where displaced Vulpines gather. Those who fled the corporate purges in the outer settlements. They have no ship capable of the jump to safer space. If we do not help them, no one will. Callum looked at the chart, then at her, then did the math on their dwindling fuel reserves and the bounty still climbing on both their heads. That's a detour, he said. A big one. Into more danger, not less. Yes. You're asking a lot. I am not asking, Vashti said, ears back. I am telling you where we are going, and you may drop me there and continue on your own path if that suits you better. Callum almost laughed. He'd stopped being surprised, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, at how much this woman assumed he'd abandon her the second it became inconvenient. He wondered, not for the first time, exactly how many humans had taught her to expect that. Set the course, he said instead. I didn't marry you to bail the first time things got complicated. Something crossed her face, surprise quickly hidden, and she busied herself with the NAV console rather than answer. Corvain Deep turned out to be a half-collapsed mining relay, life support flickering, home to 41 Vulpine refugees crammed into cargo holds never meant to house anyone, let alone families. Children, Callum saw with a lurch in his gut he hadn't expected, small ones, some barely old enough to walk, ears too big for their heads yet, watching the Marigold dock with wide, frightened gold eyes. "We cannot take 41 people," Callum said quietly, doing the math on his ship's life support, his fuel, his cargo capacity, none of which had ever been designed for this. "The Marigold's rated for 6, maybe 8 in an emergency." "Then we make 8 trips if we must," Vashti said, already moving among her people, speaking low and fast in her own language, checking wounds, holding children, her whole bearing transformed into something Callum hadn't seen yet. Not the furious noblewoman, not the guarded fugitive, but a leader, steady and certain, the kind people leaned on without being asked to. He watched her a long moment, something shifting quietly in his chest, and then went to go recalculate his fuel margins, because apparently that was his life now. They made 3 trips over 5 days, ferrying refugees in relay to a rendezvous point Vashti arranged through channels Callum didn't ask too many questions about. Old smuggling contacts, he guessed, people who owed her family favors from before whatever had happened to her family. Each trip was more dangerous than the last. Word had spread that the runaway bride was moving refugees, and the bounty hunters started showing up at the relay points too, forcing detours, forcing risks. On the last trip, ferrying 11 refugees including 6 children through a debris field to dodge a patrol cutter, Callum flew maneuvers he never attempted outside a simulator, sweat soaking through his shirt, while Vashti sat in the cockpit beside him. Not the co-pilot's chair anymore, he realized distantly, but genuinely beside him, one clawed hand braced on the console, calling out debris vectors in a voice gone rough with tension, trusting him with the lives in the hold behind them in a way she would never have trusted him 3 weeks ago. They made it. Barely. The Marigold limped into the rendezvous point with one thruster smoking and half her hull plating scored black, and the refugees disembarked into the arms of a waiting relief convoy, and Vashti stood at the base of the ramp watching them go, tail low, ears drooping with something that looked like relief and grief both at once. "You did that," Callum said, coming to stand beside her. "All of it. I just flew the ship." "We did it," she said, quiet, not looking at him. "I could not have managed the debris field alone. I would have gotten us all killed." "Yeah, well." Callum rubbed the back of his neck. "Guess we make an okay team, for a fake marriage." Vashti's ears flicked, and for the first time since Kesavar, something that was almost a smile touched the corner of her mouth. "An okay team," she agreed. "I suppose that is progress." The trouble found them properly 2 weeks later, on a corporate mining world called Haveston's Reach, where they'd gone to sell off salvage from the scrapyard fight and resupply, and where a man named Governor Aldous Marrow, a compact-appointed administrator with a reputation for corruption that stretched 3 sectors wide, had apparently taken a very personal interest in the bounty on their heads. "He's not after the reward money," Callum said grimly, reading the intercepted calm traffic on a stolen data slate in a dockside cantina, voice low. "Or not just the money. Look at this. These aren't standard bounty postings. He's cross-referencing Vulpine noble bloodlines. He thinks you're—" Callum stopped, looked up at her. Vashti's face had gone very still. "Thinks I'm what?" she said too carefully. "Says here, possible match to Thorncall Royal Cadet Branch. Verify against the missing Ashwin line." Callum frowned at the words. "What's the Ashwin line?" For a long moment, Vashti said nothing at all. The cantina noise seemed to fade around them, the clatter of glasses, the murmur of dock workers, all of it distant, unimportant, while she sat with her hands very still on the table and her gold eyes fixed somewhere far away. "The Ashwin line," she said finally, "is the royal bloodline of the Vulpine throne. My mother's line." She swallowed. "I did not lie to you, exactly, Callum. Thorncall is my mother's married name, my father's clan. But before that—" She stopped again. "Vashti." Callum kept his voice gentle, though his pulse was hammering. "Who are you?" She looked at him then, really looked, gold eyes bright with something that might have been tears, might have been fury, might have been both. "My birth name," she said, "is Vesherin Ashwin. Only daughter of Queen Sorin Ashwin, ruler of the Vulpine Deep Court. Believed dead these 6 years past since the purges took our home world and scattered what remained of our line across the rim." Her jaw tightened. "I let the galaxy believe the princess died with her mother's court. It was safer that way. For everyone." Callum sat back, the data slate forgotten in his hand, processing this the way a man processes a hyperspace jump gone wrong. Too much information, too fast, no solid ground to stand on. "You're the Queen's daughter," he said. "You're Vashti, your royalty. Actual, real royalty. I am a fugitive with a target on her back regardless of what title you attach to it," she said sharply. "The crown means nothing without a court, without a homeland, without a people to rule. I am the last living Ashwin. That does not make me a princess. It makes me a liability, to myself, to you, to anyone who shelters me." Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the last words. "This is why I did not tell you. Because the moment men like Merrill learn the truth, the bounty on my head will not be 20,000 credits. It will be a king's ransom, and every hunter and slaver and corrupt governor between here and the core will come for us both." Callum reached across the table, slow, careful, and put his hand over hers where it lay clenched on the tabletop. She startled, gold eyes flying to his face, but she didn't pull away. "Okay," he said. "So the stakes just got a lot higher. That doesn't change what I said 3 weeks ago. I didn't marry you to bail the first time things got complicated. Princess or fugitive or both, you're still you. That's who I signed up to protect." Something in her face cracked open, just slightly, just for a moment, the guarded fury giving way to something raw and unguarded and frightened underneath. "You are the strangest human I have ever known, Callum Reyes," she whispered. "Yeah," he said, and found himself smiling despite everything. "You've mentioned." They made it off Haviston's reach with 40 seconds to spare, Merrow's private security force closing on the docking bay as the Marigold blasted free, and it was somewhere in the chaos of that escape, alarms blaring, Hull groaning under thruster strain, Vashti gripping the console beside him with white-knuckled hands. That Callum realized, with a strange, quiet certainty that had nothing to do with the danger they were in, that he'd stopped thinking of this marriage as a legal technicality sometime in the last month, and started thinking of it as something else entirely. Something he didn't have a name for yet, except that it terrified him more than any bounty hunter ever had. They ran for the better part of 2 weeks after Haviston's reach, ducking through backwater systems and abandoned relay stations, always one jump ahead of whichever hunter Merrow's growing bounty had roused this time. It should have been exhausting, it was exhausting, but somewhere in the running, something between them had shifted, gentled, into something neither of them examined too closely. It was Vashti who taught Callum, over the long dead hours of a 3-day transit through empty space, how Vulpine hand signs worked, the subtle language of ear position and tail movement that conveyed things words couldn't, trust and warning and grief compressed into gesture. "This," she said, demonstrating, ears half raised, tilted slightly forward, "means I am glad you are here. It is a small thing. We do not say it with words, usually. Words feel too large for it." Callum tried to mimic the gesture with his own decidedly non-Vulpine features, waggling his eyebrows in what he hoped was an approximation, and Vashti laughed, actually laughed, a bright, surprised sound he'd never heard from her before, quickly muffled behind her hand like she wasn't sure she was allowed. "You look ridiculous," she said, still smiling. "I contain multitudes," Callum said. "Ridiculous is one of them." It was Callum, in turn, who taught her chess, on a battered magnetic board he kept in a drawer beneath the cockpit console, a relic from a father he didn't talk about much. She took to it with unsettling speed, beating him 3 games out of 5 by the end of their first night, and declared the game a poor simulation of real strategy, since a Vulpine commander would simply burn the board rather than play by such constrained rules. Which made Callum laugh so hard he nearly knocked the pieces to the floor. It was in the small hours of a night neither of them could sleep through, drifting in a debris field to avoid a patrol sweep, that she finally told him the rest of it, the purge that had taken her mother's court, the 6 years of hiding, moving from safe house to safe house, always one step from discovery, always alone with the weight of a crown she'd never wanted and a people she felt she'd failed simply by surviving when so many hadn't. "I do not know how to be what they need," she admitted, voice small in the darkened cockpit, tail curled tight around her own knees. "A queen. A symbol. I know how to run. I know how to fight. I do not know how to rule. For what it's worth," Callum said quietly, "the people at Corvain Deep didn't need a queen. They needed someone who showed up, who fought for them, who got them out. You did that. Maybe that's most of what ruling actually is, when you get down to it. Showing up." She was quiet a long moment. Then, so soft he almost missed it. "Thank you, Callum." It was the first time she'd used his name without an edge of challenge in it, and something in his chest went warm and unsteady, like ground shifting under a foundation he hadn't realized was cracked. It was 3 days after that, docked at a quiet, unremarkable trading post far from any bounty hunter's usual haunts, restocking supplies under assumed names, that Callum found her on the Marigold's narrow observation deck, watching a nebula bloom violet and gold across the black, and found himself standing beside her without quite deciding to. "You've been different," he said. "Since Corvain Deep. Good different. I like it." "You have been different too," she said, not looking away from the nebula. "You do not flinch anymore when I raise my voice. You used to. You used to be trying to make me flinch. Perhaps." A small, private smile. "I am not anymore. Trying, I mean." They stood in silence a while, close enough that her tail brushed against his leg, either of them moving away from it. "Vashti," he said finally. "Vesherin. Whichever you want me to call you. I need you to know something, and I need you to know I'm not saying it because of the treaty, or the tribunal review, or any of the reasons this marriage started." She turned to look at him then, gold eyes wide and searching in the dim light, ears tilted forward in that gesture she taught him. "I am glad you are here," except now it was directed at him, and his heart nearly stopped at the sight of it. "Say it," she said, quiet. "I don't know when it happened," Callum said, throat tight. "Maybe it was the scrapyard, or Corvain Deep, or 3 nights ago when you beat me at chess for the 9th time in a row and looked so damn pleased with yourself I couldn't breathe right for an hour. But somewhere in all this running, I stopped thinking of you as a stranger I married to save your life. I started thinking of you as—" He stopped, searching for words big enough. "As someone I can't imagine my life without. I know that's not what either of us signed up for. I know you might not." "Callum." Her hand came up, claws gentle against his jaw, turning his face toward hers. "I have been trying to find the courage to say the same thing for a week. I did not know if you would want to hear it, from a fugitive queen with a bounty on her head and nothing left to offer but danger. You've got plenty to offer," he said, voice rough. "Vesherin. You've got everything. All of it. I want all of it." She kissed him then, or he kissed her. Neither of them was ever quite sure afterward which of them moved first, only that the nebula bloomed silent and vast behind them and neither of them was watching it anymore. The peace didn't last. It never does, not in a story like theirs, not with a bounty the size of a small planet's treasury still hanging over both their heads. It was a slaver consortium that found them next. Not bounty hunters after Marrow's reward, but something colder and older, a syndicate that had been quietly trafficking displaced Vulpines for years under cover of labor resettlement contracts, and who had, through channels Vashti refused to fully explain, learned exactly who the Marigold's passenger really was. "A royal bloodline is worth more as a hostage than a corpse," the consortium's negotiator told them over a calm channel, 3 days after they'd left the trading post, voice smooth as oil. Deliver the girl to Threnody Station, and your bounty problem disappears. Your ship, your freedom, all of it guaranteed. Refuse, and we simply take her by force, and you, Mr. Reyes, become collateral damage. Your choice. Callum cut the channel without responding, jaw tight, and found Vashti already suiting up in the cargo hold, checking the charge on a plasma pistol with hands that were steady despite everything. You are not considering their offer, she said, not quite a question. Not for one damn second, Callum said. But we need a plan, because a full slaver consortium's got a lot more guns than 3 bounty hunters and a corrupt sheriff. Then we do not fight them with guns, Vashti said. We fight them with what they actually want. The plan she outlined was reckless, borderline suicidal, and entirely in keeping with everything Callum had learned about her in the past 2 months. They would let the consortium's ship pull them in, let the boarding party come aboard the Marigold expecting an easy hostage extraction, and then Vashti, queen of a scattered people, warrior in her own right, done hiding from what she was, would reveal exactly who she was to the boarding party's rank and file, most of whom, Vashti gambled, were themselves displaced Vulpines pressed into service under threat rather than loyal converts to the slavers' cause. You're betting your life, Callum said, on the hope that enough of them will turn rather than follow orders. I am betting my life, Vashti corrected, on the same thing you bet yours on, in that execution square 2 months ago. That people, given the choice, will sometimes surprise you. It worked. Barely, messily, with 3 tense minutes where Callum genuinely believed they were both about to die surrounded by armed slavers in his own cargo hold, but it worked. Vashti stood in the center of the boarding party, unarmed, chin lifted, and spoke to the pressed Vulpine crew in words that made more than half of them lower their weapons, ears dropping in shame or reverence or both, until the consortium's actual commanding officer found himself alone, weapon drawn against a room that had turned against him, and made the sensible choice to surrender rather than die for a paycheck. Afterward, in the wreckage of the boarding fight, Callum found Vashti sitting against the cargo crate, hands shaking now that the danger had passed, and sat down beside her without a word, letting her lean into his shoulder while the adrenaline burned itself out of both their systems. That was insane, he said finally. Yes, she agreed. I love you, he said, the words slipping out before he'd quite decided to say them, but not one he wanted to take back. I don't think I've said that yet. Properly. I love you, Vesherin. She turned her face up to his, gold eyes bright with exhaustion and something warmer underneath. I love you too, Callum Reyes. Grasping human that you are. The coordinates to the hidden Vulpine homeland, the last unconquered fragment of the deep court, tucked behind a nebula that scrambled long-range sensors and had, for 6 years, kept the scattered remnant of Vashti's people safe from further purges. Came from the freed slaver crew, 3 of whom, it turned out, had once served in Queen Soren's household guard before the purges scattered them to the rim. You're certain, Callum said, running the coordinates against the Marigold's aging NAV computer, that this isn't a trap? That we're not about to fly into another ambush? I am not certain of anything, Vashti said. But I recognize the encryption cipher. It is my mother's. Only her household guard would carry it. Her voice caught. If it is truly them, if any of my mother's court survived. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Callum reached over and took her hand, and she gripped it back hard enough to hurt, and neither of them said anything else until the jump was calculated and the Marigold threw herself into the black one more time. They came out of hyperspace into a system Callum had never seen on any chart, a small yellow star wrapped in the tattered veil of a nebula that made his sensors scream static, and beyond it, half hidden in the debris of an old asteroid belt reshaped into a defensible ring, a settlement. Not grand, not the shining royal court of old propaganda holos, but real, alive, hundreds of lights glowing warm against the dark, and ships, dozens of them, patrol craft bristling with defensive weapons that swung to track the Marigold the instant she dropped out of the jump. They will not fire, Vashti said, though her hands were white-knuckled on the console. Not if I signal correctly. Not if. A calm channel crackled open before she finished. A voice, ancient and rough with disbelief, spoke words in the old Vulpine tongue that Callum's translator rendered a half-second late, too stunned by its own translation to keep pace. Is it truly you? Princess Vesherin? We had given up hope you still lived. Vashti, Vesherin, closed her eyes for a long moment, tears finally slipping free down her face, 6 years of grief and hiding and running breaking loose all at once. It is I, she said, voice thick. I have come home. And I have not come alone. The deep court's remnant received them with a strange, careful mix of jubilation and wariness. Jubilation, because their lost princess had returned alive, against every reasonable expectation. Wariness, because she'd returned married to a human, and 6 years of purges at human corporate hands had left the surviving court with little reason to trust Callum's kind. It took weeks. Weeks of council meetings Callum wasn't invited to, weeks of Vesherin arguing his case before elders who remembered the purges too vividly to easily forgive, before the court's regent, an elderly Vulpine named Sorwick who had held the throne in trust through 6 years of her presumed death, finally summoned Callum before the full council to speak for himself. You married our princess, Sorwick said, ancient gold eyes hard and assessing. To save her from an execution square. A legal technicality, nothing more. Why should this council believe it has become anything else? Callum stood in the center of the council chamber, painfully aware of every eye on him, and thought about the answer he wanted to give, something honest, unpolished, true. I can't prove what's in my heart to a room full of strangers, he said finally. All I can tell you is what I've done these past 3 months. I've bled for your people. I've flown refugees through minefields to keep them safe. I stood in a cargo hold surrounded by armed slavers and didn't run, because the woman I love was standing there unarmed, betting her life that her people would choose freedom over fear. I don't need this council to believe I love her. I just need you to let her decide for herself whether she believes it. That's all I'm asking. Silence, long and heavy. Then Vesherin stepped forward from where she'd been standing at the chamber's edge, chin lifted, and said, in a voice that filled the room, I have already decided, Regent Sorwick. I decided somewhere in a debris field 2 months ago, and confirmed it in a cargo hold 3 weeks past, and I will not have this council debate a truth that is mine to know. Callum Reyes is my husband. Not by treaty technicality. By choice. My choice. And I would make it again, 1,000 times, in 1,000 execution squares. Sorwick studied her a long moment, then looked at Callum, and something in the old regent's stern face softened, just slightly. Then, Sorwick said, perhaps this council owes you both a proper wedding. One made in truth, rather than desperation. If you would have it. Vesherin turned to Callum, eyes bright, ears tilted forward. I am glad you are here. And Callum found he couldn't speak past the tightness in his throat, so he simply nodded, and reached for her hand, and held on. The second wedding was nothing like the first. There was no dust, no chains, no magistrate reading a sentence off a data slate in a bored monotone. There was a court garden grown wild and beautiful in the shelter of the asteroid ring, strung with lights that mimicked starlight, and Vulpine elders singing old songs of the deep court in voices cracked with 6 years of grief finally giving way to hope, and 41 refugees from Corvain deep among the gathered crowd, along with dozens more Vesherin and Callum had rescued or fought beside in the months since Kesavar. All of them come to bear witness. Callum stood at the center of it in a borrowed formal coat that didn't quite fit right, feeling more nervous than he had in that execution square 2 months before, and watched Vesherin walk toward him in Vulpine's ceremonial dress, red gold fur bright against deep blue fabric, gold eyes fixed on his the whole way, and thought, with a clarity that startled him, I would do it all again. Every mile of it. Just to end up here. Do you, Callum Reyes? Regent Sorwick intoned. Take this woman, Vesherin Ashwin, princess of the deep court, as your wife, in truth and in choice, forsaking all others for as long as you both shall live. I do, Callum said, and meant it more than he'd ever meant anything. And do you, Veteran Ashwin, take this man, Callum Reyes, as your husband, in truth and in choice, forsaking all others, for as long as you both shall live? Veteran's smile broke wide and unguarded, the fierce noblewoman from the execution square transformed into something soft and radiant and entirely, unmistakably in love. I do, she said. Gladly. Fully. Without a single reservation left in my heart. The court erupted into cheers, actual cheers, warm and bright, nothing like the ugly laughter of that Kesavar crowd 2 months before. And Callum kissed his wife under a sky full of borrowed starlight, surrounded by a people who had, against every reasonable expectation, found their way home. The Marigold still flew the frontier lanes, though she'd been refitted twice since Kesavar, new hull plating, a rebuilt hyperdrive, a proper second cabin that Callum had installed himself over a long, happy month in the Deep Court's shipyards. She still smelled faintly of engine grease and dried rations, but now she also carried the scent of the small greenhouse Veteran had insisted on installing in the aft cargo bay, full of herbs and flowers from her homeland's soil. Callum still ran cargo runs, though these days half of them were quiet supply missions for the Deep Court's growing settlement, and the other half were something closer to diplomatic missions, Veteran. Queen Veteran now, formally crowned 8 months past when Regent Sorwick finally stepped down, though she still preferred Vashti, from the man who'd married her twice, negotiating trade and asylum agreements between her scattered people and the wider compact worlds, one careful treaty at a time. They still argued. Veteran still won most of the chess games. Callum still forgot his sidearm at inopportune moments, and Veteran still despaired of him for it, though these days the despair came wrapped in fondness rather than fury. On a quiet evening, drifting between systems on their way back from a supply run to Corvain Deep, resettled now, thriving, a proper waypoint rather than a half-collapsed ruin, Veteran found Callum on the observation deck, watching a nebula bloom violet and gold, the same colors as the one where they'd first said the words that changed everything. She came to stand beside him, tail brushing his leg the way it always did now, and tilted her ears forward. I am glad you are here, she said in words this time, though she still used the old gesture too, when words weren't quite enough. Yeah, Callum said, pulling her close, resting his chin against the top of her head, feeling the whole strange, impossible shape of his life settle warm and certain around him. Me too. Every single day. Outside the stars wheeled on, indifferent and endless, and inside the aging hull of a freighter that had once carried a desperate rescue and now carried something far more permanent, a queen and her husband watched the dark together, unafraid, exactly where they'd chosen to be.